Men først og fremst, ser dere dette?
Ja.
Ja, ok,
Det gjør
bra.
vi.
Flott, da det hele bildet står der, og så nå gjerne vil jeg, altså tema som blir spurt om her på svensk heter vel kognitiv bedømning, og utredning av personer med medfødt døvblindhet, utmaning og muligheter. Og da den engelske blir vel, skifter jeg nå til språk, it's about cognitive evaluation and assessment of persons with congenital deaf blindness, challenges and opportunities. So my talk will be more on evaluation and assessment, just give you all some basic framework to understand how assessment could be done in this group of people with deaf blindness, but also specifically in persons with congenital deaf blindness. There are many of us here today. Some of you all are working in the field. So let me just start by putting up this slide. Let's say this is the, okay. As you could see, I just wanted to give a kind of definition or description of what is meant by congenital deaf blindness. As it says here, it's a concomitant. That means it's like two of the two impairments are occurring simultaneously, and it's a combination which causes severe complication and other developmental and educational needs, right? So hearing and visual impairments together. Often we talk about hearing and vision on the peripheral level, that means like the eyes and the ears, but in recent years one has started to look at this also from a brain-related manner, that is like hearing and vision related to brain impairments. So that is something new in the field to understand and have an understanding of how that affects a person with combination of the both of the senses. Okay, so just a short introduction to the group. So what I would like now also to, let's see, back here. Yeah, it is. Yes. To give an overview of what I would like to be talking, I would be talking about today, right? So it's like there are some topics which I would go across here, just generally understanding assessment and cognitive functions, how it is being done generally. Many of these things are most probably familiar for many of you all, but just to go through it and give a framework before ending up to understand how to assess and cognitive functions in persons with deaf blindness. So these are the points I would go through. And so I'll start with the first one, which is understanding, assessment, and process of cognitive functions, right? So, well, as this lecture suggests, that we want to understand the best way to do an assessment with people with deaf blindness. So what are the different aspects or assessment methods which exist? So in a very broad view, we could look at this in this way. We have assessments. On one side, we have standardized assessment, and which is normative, concessions based, and then we have the other side, which is more less standardized, which falls under multi-method informant assessments, ecological assessments, and dynamic assessments. So we need to understand both these factors to know and do assessments with people with deaf blindness. Okay, so let's start with the assessment, standardized assessments. Let's see. Okay, that is. So many of you all know what it is, so I'm not going to use a lot of time, but let's start with what we call assessment concession. This is again the tests which you are using, which are the standardized tests, and doing something with that to minimize the impact for the person who's being assessed, such that we could, in a way, help the person to perform the tests, right? So this falls into two categories. One is called an accommodation. This is like the more basic level of accommodating a test, which is like any kind of test you do, enlarging or contrast of the test using sound amplification, or any kind of gestures or sign-on methods to demonstration and instructions are based on. More on a basic level. But then, of course, you have the more next level, which is test modification. Some of the things which Amy Tuomi spoke about last time will fall also into the type of test modification, but also test accommodation has been mentioned in a lecture the last time, right? So again, we could use the standardized test in a way to accommodate or modify to it, right? I would like here in this lecture to address the issue of standardized tests, in this case, the translation of auditory verbal items into equal visual signs, a paper written by Bridget in 2022. And in this manner, it's okay. Just I'll mention about her research in a while, but then again to put in contrasting assessment concession with normative assessments, and in this case we're talking about again tests which are administered in a standardized manner, and then again how you interpret the results comparing to person scores to an appropriate normative group, and that's where the normative assessment concept comes from. And then most of the tests are again norm selected to person gender, age, education, and so forth. So again, we get a good example of how the person is compared to the person's age, gender, and education, and do the interpretation accordingly, right? So that's many of the things most of you all know about, right? So what are the standardized tests which are available? Well, there are two types of it. One is called the performance-based tests, and the other one is self-informant report measures. These are the two most used clinical methods of capturing individual differences. Again, right? So one is like doing the test, and then the other one is like giving a questionnaire to, in a way, capture a kind of cognitive domain. So these are the two most used, as many of you all know, are commonly used when we talk about cognitive assessment. So here again, some examples of it. We have performance-based tests can be organized into different cognitive functional domains, such as intelligence, perceptual motor functions, language, attention, executive function, social cognition. So again, here, Campbell and colleagues have given an overview of the evidence-based cognitive assessments, especially for the pediatric population. So more on that in that paper. But anyway, you'll get the picture of when we talk about performance tests, we are measuring something based on the different cognitive functional domains. And on the other hand, we have this self-report or informant report measures. In a way, we try to measure everyday cognitive function as proxy measures for real world functioning. So there are many of them. While I'm more used of using the cognitive failure questionnaire, the brief, it's a executive function inventory. And then there's the working memory questionnaire, which we just have translated into Norwegian, and trying to use that as a cognitive functioning in the adult population. So there are some measures which can be used to understand cognitive functioning based on questionnaires too, right? So let's we'll get back to that in a while. Again, based on let's see, problems here. Okay. Getting moving. Okay. Good. I said I'll get back to the ASL, which is the American Sign Language translation of the VCI, which is the Verbal Comprehensive Index from the WISC-5. So Bridget has done a kind of, or a good study on the on translating it into sign language. And the ultimate objective of the study is to provide psychologists with traditional tools for the VCI administration, including a training material for the standardized ACL translation. So I would suggest for those who are working within especially the deaf or hearing impaired field, to look at that and get an idea of how it has been done. But she also says clearly that, again, another objective for this study is also to learn about the limitations of the translation index per se. So just translating into something, we need to know how good it is, because that's part of the evaluation as an assessment. Just to give you one idea of one of the tests which could be done in a assessment modification manner, but we still need to know the limitations regarding that. Another type of test, which is also based on the standardized manner, which is called the non-intelligence or non-verbal intelligence test, right? Some of you all might know about the Snyder's-Oman non-verbal intelligence test. Earlier, there were people using the lighter R, the lighter 3. So again, most of the tests measure non-verbal intelligence. And here, this is an example of cognitive testing of individuals with challenges of verbal communication. We call them non-verbal and language-reduced tests in a way, right? So regarding this, it seems that the Snyder's-Oman non-verbal intelligence tests are well suited for use with children of ethnic minorities, and it seems to be a fair assessment of children with cultural minorities. So again, trying to, in a way, reduce the language in those tests, and then try to a fair assessment for children with cultural minorities. But again, the SON IQ, which is the total IQ, appears to give a systematically higher score than the total score from the WISC-5 in children with cognitive difficulties. So again, we need to know that might happen too. That is, the total score from a SON IQ might seem to be different, or higher than the total score from the WISC-4, so 5, sorry. So again, knowing these things are also important, but again, these are tests which could be used too. I mean, these are, again, well suited for non-verbal assessments. So need to do that and understand their limitations again. Then the last time we were talking, as Emmy had mentioned, there are non-reference inventories, such as the Baileys, which has been mentioned and modified and accommodated in the population Emmy was talking about. And then you have all the other adaptive behavior skills, right? We know the relevance, and we know also the shortcomings of these tests, but there are measures which you'd always consider to make evaluation of something, and those are important to consider, right? Even though we could always talk about, are they good enough, normed, and so forth, but it's enough to give a kind of snapshot of a cognitive ability or cognitive function. So it's important to consider them too. But again, when in this group of children, when you have a hearing and visual impairment, like in, for instance, children with Charge syndrome, it seems the scores from the ABES seems to vary according to the medical involvement. That means the medical symptoms the child has, and a degree of vision seems to be related to the adaptive behavior scores, and it seems they also related to age at walking. So again, Charge syndrome itself is a genetic syndrome. It's not what we measure when we use a scale like this. It's the variance and the differences will come regarding, as mentioned here, regarding medical involvement, especially degree of vision will affect the scores in a adaptive behavior scale, right? So just to know how the sensory impairment will give a different individual differences will appear regarding the sensory impairment in issue. And then we have the third part is like, even though we have performance-based tests and self-improvement report measures, but there is a lack of correlation between those two, right? We are using them, right? We know we use them, measure a performance in a test situation, and we are using informant report. But basically, there's a lack of correlation between those two, right? And that's one of the things have been, in a way, been mentioned over many years. But here it's a study across series of domains, cognitive domains. Recent meta-analysis and large-scale investigations have consistently found that performance-based tests and self-report measures of the same construct were weakly correlated, right? In a way, they go into different ways. We use them, right? We use them to test them. We use the tests, but they are going into two different directions, right? So the question is why? Why are they not measuring the same, even though we were using the same concept? You could take working memory or executive functions, any kind of cognitive measures. You see that the tests, they don't correlate when you ask how they are doing or performing in everyday life, right? This is still a mystery. We haven't solved it, why it is, right? There are some suggestions in a way. Of course, we could always talk about the type of measurements. Clinical tests more structured, and in a test situation is different when you ask the person how you're performing in an everyday life. But there's also neuroscience suggesting there is a difference between the connectivity in brain functions regarding the structural connectivity and the functional connectivity. So it seems the performance test is more related to the structural connectivity of the brain functions, while the self-informant or report measures are much related to the functional connectivity in the brain. So maybe there might be an answer, and that's one of the things which have been proposed in a way. So maybe that's why we don't find a relationship between these two. But we use them. We need them. We need to know how they're performing in a test, in a test situation, and we need to know how they're performing in a manner in an everyday life. So these are two very important parts of an assessment. So comes the next part, which is the other assessment pathways. I spoke about the standardized assessments regarding tests and questionnaires, and then of course the assessment of concessions. But there are other ways of doing assessments. These are much more lesser normative in the sense, right, or compared to the other part which I just mentioned. But let me go through it in a way, just give you an understanding of what is meant by them. Many of these aspects are definitely familiar for you all. One is the multi-method, multi-informant assessments, like every assessor would do that in gathering comprehensive background information, formally or informally, to understand the full scope of the person's cognitive capabilities and vulnerabilities, right? So anything of previous medical developmental reports, interviews with teachers, family members, staff, everything, to make sure that we get a good enough background information, formally or informally. But again, that's the scope of this assessment. Even when we are doing normalized norm-based tests or performance tests, we still need to get this. So this is part of it, which is like many of you all are very aware of, right? And the next one is ecological assessment, which is like something new in the field, especially within neuropsychology. It's again trying to identify certain cognitive behaviors in different situations or settings in which a person may function on an optimal level. So as you could see here, as the 4 arrows show, we will do a comprehensive background information. We'll maybe do a performance test. We might even get self-report, but those are all may be measuring the deficit aspect of the person. So what is this needed is observational measures of everyday competency, right? So how are we going to put this into the formal in a way? We know the 3 are, even though they are poor correlated, but we still use them in our assessment to get a better understanding of how the person is functioning. So that in this manner, we're asking, how are we going to bring in the positive part into it? And as the Amato mentions, as an ecological neuropsychology perspective, a strength-based approach that considers the person as well the system within which he or she interacts is important when assessing cognition. And this is again, I always wondered. I had an assessment of a young man not long ago at the university clinic, and I was giving him tests of visual sequential tests, right? So he was doing it, and well, at one point we found out it was poor performance, right? And then he goes out, get his break, and is sitting in the waiting room, and then I see how he was working on his phone, right? He was multitasking, he was linking, he was working on it. I said, what am I measuring in my test, right? In the test situation, he was not doing well. When he comes out of the room, he's working on his phone and he's doing exactly visual sequencing, right? So what am I missing in a way? And the question is how I'm going to get that information into the cognitive functions or functioning of it. At present, we look at that, but then we in the near future, we need to, in a way, bring that into the assessment too, right? And Robert Bilder, who has written a lot about the future of neuropsychological testing, and this, in a way, that's what he says. The next generation of testing is use the technology we have, like mobile platforms or smartphones or smart cars or whatever, to see how they are functioning in everyday life and bring that information into the assessment too, just to know, to put that into the equation and incorporate it in our total understanding of the person's cognitive functions, right? Not to mention AI. I don't know where that's going, but anyway. So, but just to bringing the competency of the person into the assessment is very important. This is also not within the field which I'm talking about, but even now, when it comes to cognitively elderly, healthy older adults, it suggests that together with the cognitive correlates of self-report, performance-based measures, a direct observation measure of functional status within the person's environment will provide a valid determination of everyday functioning in the cognitively healthy older adults. This means exactly what I say. If you want to know about and older adults, their functioning, it's not enough just to have self-reports about their deficits or performance-based tests on their deficits, but a measure of functional status, right? And especially in the next future, when we will have a bigger group of healthy older adults, this is very important to consider. Okay. So this is more on the ecological part of it. So let's go to the next part, which is the dynamic assessment, right? So this is again something which I'll bring back when I talk about assessing persons with congenital deaf brain. So, but what is dynamic assessment? Many of you are familiar with the concept, but again, just to give a kind of description of it, it's a range of assessment formats whose core is in integrating assessment and instruction into a unified activity, right? So it's again within the test, any kind of test, any kind of assessment activity, we are going to do an assessment at the same time trying to introduce the instruction, in this sense, any kind of mediating, scaffolding to, in a way, to integrate that within the assessment. So the general principle of the dynamic assessment is that guided learning can make a valuable contribution to the assessment process and assist in identifying learning potentials and effective learning strategies. So it's the main of it to understanding the strategies on learning potential. So dynamic assessment might be the right way to go. So how do we see this in testing in a way, in assessment? So generally, there's many different models of dynamic assessment, but I'll just focus on one of the most used one. It's called the sandwich format. That is, you do an assessment, you do a reassessment, and in between, you do a kind of intervene. As you say, provide strategies or feedback or guided learning, anything in a way will give a kind of to boost the learning and see how the person will use that knowledge in the second round. So it's an assess and reassess. So going back to the SONAR, so why the SONAR appears to give a systematically higher score than the FSIQ on the WISC-5? Well, one of the discussions which has been mentioned is test feedback issues. What the examiner offers after each item, informing whether the answer was right or wrong, or maybe helping find the correct solution, which is incorporated in the feedback issues when administrating the SON tests in a way, right? So the authors mentioned because of this aspect, the SONAR has similarities with the learning potential or dynamic assessment test than with the traditional test of intelligence, right? So important to know the framework of what this test measures in a way, not just the scores and comparing them, but what are the basis of it. And many of you all know this test is actually it's 70 years ago. This test was introduced, and it was based on understanding cognitive assessment in children with deafness, right? But now it seems to be more of a mainstream test, which is used in many other different populations. So, but again, trying to understand here, is that the feedback issue which is here, giving it the test a framework within a dynamic assessment? This is one of the issues which have been put forward regarding the highest score compared to the WISC total score. So that's one way of looking at the dynamic assessment issue. And then, of course, we could also use standardized tests and then talk about dynamic assessment. Is that possible? Is that possible to use standardized tests in a dynamic manner, right? I'll give you one example, and this will, for instance, an article by Kirkwood mentions a dynamic assessment approach used to examine the source of performance on the Ray Ostrich complex figure test. Many of you all might know what it is, and it's within 202 school-age children referred for learning difficulties. So I'm going to give an example of how the Ray test was used in a dynamic manner, right? So with children referred for learning difficulties. So the first part is like, I'll show you a picture of the Ray and the dynamic assessment part of it. Here it is on my left. You could see the standard Ray figure, which many of you all know about, right? So first it's about administrating in a standard fashion, draw and reproduce, recall, and then 20 minutes later, a delayed recall, right? So what we see is like most of the children, almost every children, their scores were below age expectations for the copy and recall conditions, right? Even though they were referred for learning problems, but they had also problems in their visual processing in a manner, right? So it seems like the Ray had captured something more than a verbal test would do, right? So in this study, they tried to use the Ray in a dynamic manner. So I could see on my right side, they broke down the elements of the Ray, and it's like presented in a overlay and acetate, like a transparent plastic paper, and it's like first the huge, the main, and then parts of it were given to get the whole picture, right? So I could say like it was broken down into pieces, and to give another organizational structure and to give all at the same time, right? So this is how the ray was in a way presented in a dynamic assessment manner, right? So breaking down the structures into smaller parts and then giving the person, the child, the opportunity to, in a way, structure that. So what is the results of it, right? So one thing we could expect is when you do this test, is it such that every children will do well on it, right? Because then again, well, what's the part of doing? What's the purpose of doing a dynamic assessment? Because it's like you're just breaking down the test and say, okay, you're spoiling the test. Or is there going to be children who are going to benefit from it and not benefit from it? Because that's an important part of it. We want to know not just that the child is doing poor on the array, but what are the reasons they are using being or performing poor on this test, right? So if the answer was every children was doing better, then maybe you might say, okay, well, that was expected. But what they found was something different. They found two groups, which they called it those who were benefiting, the Ben group, and those who were not benefiting. It's the no Ben group, right? So the first group, the Ben group, that's the majority of these children, because of the dynamic structuring and procedure, even though in the initial test they did poorly, but in this case, when they got another way to organize their visual processing, and they did much better, right? They benefited from it. And the reason behind is because this might be reflecting difficulties in metacognitive or planning difficulties rather than basic perceptual or spatial processing, right? That's why when you gave the test in a dynamic manner, they, in a way, could benefit from it. Well, there was another group which did not benefit from it, right? However, the test was modified and done in a dynamic manner. They were still having problems to do the test, right? And this might be because they have more fundamental visual, perceptual, and visual spatial skills rather than metacognitive, right? So again, by doing a test in a dynamic manner, we might not only see who is benefiting and not benefiting, but we might also understanding the underlying cognitive mechanisms that the child might lack or might have in this sense, right? So again, doing the assessment in a very more fine-tuned manner, a dynamic assessment could help us with, right? So as it says further, well, the group didn't differ in general cognitive ability or age, nor did they differ in any specific cognitive domain or any other demographic variable. So when you control for all those things, there's still going to be two groups that are going to benefit and non-benefit from it. So again, finally, they say a dynamic assessment procedure can enhance the diagnostic utility of the array for children with learning disability and could serve to usefully guide intervention efforts, because that's the main thing. One is to say, okay, why you're failing, what's the poor performance reason, but also giving us more information to guide intervention efforts. This is well part of the dynamic assessment thinking or framework. So this is one way to do it, right? So in a way to use tests, there are a lot of different dynamic assessment tests done with many cognitive tests, like from the Stroop test to different other tests. I'm not going to go into details with those, but the basic understanding is such that by doing that in a way, we might capture some underlying cognitive mechanisms which are needed to understand, again, when we assess children with cognitive difficulties. So this brings us to the next topic, which is like the group of people I've been asked to talk about. These are cognitive assessment of people with congenital deaf blindness, right? So let's bring back some of the assessment pathways which I've mentioned earlier, and how would this be in regarding cognitive assessment for people with congenital deaf blindness in the first level, right? Okay, standardized assessment. They are could be used. There are some advantages of using them, right? So it's not just saying you can't use standardized assessment with children with congenital deaf blindness. That's never an issue. It's about, as you could say, there are certain things we need to consider, but we always need to say, okay, what is the possibility for using this test? So there are some advantages. Just to put them briefly, we have helpful to identify the person's cognitive capabilities and vulnerabilities in relation to their learning, as it may provide valid information or a snapshot of how a person with congenital deaf blindness is learning at that time in a controlled way. So any kind of standardized test has one advantage. It's the controlled way, right? Because here's a test situation. Most of the things are controlled. You could use assessment concessions, either modification or accommodation strategies, but again, trying to get a valid information. That's the main important thing regarding tests, right? Again, it's up to us as psychologists to use that valid information to do the final analysis, right? So again, they are important to know this test could be used because they would give us some information regarding valid information. And then, of course, it's also important regarding understanding the complex issues regarding deaf blindness and the co-occurrence of disorders, which is diagnoses which are co-occurring, and differentiating between these different disorders, which may share similar signs or symptoms, which the differential diagnosis concept, such as ASD, ADHD, cognitive decline, pseudo-regression, and intellectual disability, right? And especially, the first ASD and ADHD, you all might know how or whether cognitive assessment could help in aiding the diagnosis. But then again, regarding intellectual disabilities, yes, it could give us a picture of how the person's mental abilities are, or the functional abilities of a person's are regarding cognitive functions. So that might give us, as you say, a valid information. But again, regarding things of the norms and such things, it might not be a reliable way to categorize the intellectual deficit. That means in the sense of whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, or complex, profound. It's again might be a difficult task, but just to understand the person's intellectual disability, this test could give us definitely a valid information about it, right? And then cognitive decline in pseudo-regression, even though we could talk about that in the adult population regarding any kind of regression or cognitive regression, the concepts of mild cognitive impairment or early demands, but also with children, right? So sometimes children, because say some kids which have seen within the deafblind field, they might have a eye condition, say for instance, keratoconus is a kind of when the cornea thins out and bulges like a cone, and they could get worse quickly, right? And then they suddenly, and in addition, many of the children might rub it very hard, and then their vision might get poorer, right? And again, this might come out as a decline in their cognitions, right? So often it's not exactly a cognitive decline, but it's a pseudo-regression, but you need to understand it. So maybe some tests could give us a better picture of how this cognitive decline is, right? Because labeling them with a wrong label often is not the right thing to do. So again, this test could give us a kind of better understanding or valid information regarding such issues. There are some disadvantages already mentioned. So the first of all is like, again, they require precise administration procedures. Even though we could use assessment concessions or say assessment modification, we're still modifying the test, and we still don't know what are we doing in that sense. Are we really, in a way, understanding the test as it was originally made for, and what are the changes? This have to be mentioned, of course, but as we know, this is one of the issues that is regarding the flexibility to accommodate. How could we accommodate in all manners for a person with congenital deaf blindness, right? And of course, as I mentioned, the communication issues related to people with deaf blindness in my introduction of congenital deaf blindness. So as we know, their expressions could be often very subtle. Thus, their cognitive behavior may be easily overlooked, and their test responses might be difficult to judge during the assessment. So again, some of the things we could do by videotaping it and looking at them could, in a way, address those issues. But again, still, this issue will always be an aspect when we do a cognitive assessment of a person with congenital deaf blindness, right? And then finally, the standardized measures, the norms for this. People with normal vision and hearing are much, tests are much known for people with normal vision hearing. And then again, how could we use these norms again to predict accurately the cognitive abilities in people with congenital deaf blindness? So it's again based on how the norms are, how we, in a way, use the norms, and how we interpret the norms will always also be an issue regarding as a disadvantage when it comes of using these standardized tests, right? So again, understanding the framework is important as we as psychologists do these tests, right? So many of them are very familiar for, I suppose, many of you all. Okay, so that's the balancing act. We have these things, we still need to do it. So we need to find a kind of balancing act regarding, we have the advantages, we have the disadvantages. And so again, yeah, use them, be careful, be cautious in this manner. And when we're attempting to report an actual score. So all the special considerations which I mentioned should be mentioned, taken into consideration in a way. So that's one way of, in a way, using this test with cautions, right? So again, the next part is like, since typical scores may not correspond to the deafblind person's actual capabilities and learning experience, and thus an ecological or dynamic assessment can be helpful to identify cognitive potentials in environments that allow a person who is congenital deafblind to participate with proper support, right? So again, the principles of ecological and dynamic assessment might give us, by introducing them, might give us a better picture of the persons which we're interested to know about the learning potentials or of that person, right? Or which kind of intervention planning is needed. So again, as I mentioned, the ecological or dynamic assessment could be, in a way to address those issues, right? And finally, yeah, it's again the expertise of the psychologist, which is maybe the most important thing, right? Just as participating in this certain course and talking with colleagues and getting a kind of understanding of interpreting, that's what the expertise role is, right? There is nothing in a manual or certain test or any pathways will give us the ultimate answer. It's again working together, getting supervision and helping each other out. It's a very important part of the evaluation assessment of cognitions, where the expertise plays a very important role of it, right? So that's important to mention here again, right? So okay. So yeah, so I'll go forward. Hopefully the interpreters are doing well, right? and I'll try to find some time for questions. So it has been mentioned, if you want to ask questions, you could ask in Swedish, and I'll try to answer back. So just be free when at the end of my presentation, time for some questions, right? So this is the basic understanding of the whole assessment regarding standardized and the other pathways, right? So let's go to the next part of it, right? Okay, it's also to know how to understand the more modality aspects of cognitive functions, right? So, and it's important to know, like here in the sense, I'm going to talk more about the tactile modality, right? And it's important also to know how modality has changed, our understanding of modality in cognitive functions have changed, right? In the earlier days of the WISC, there was only one test for working memory, and that was the, as you all know, the digit span test, right? And by taking that, we concluded, well, the person has all problems with working memory, right? So in the recent years, only a visual element was put into it. Say the WISC-5 has a visual working memory, right? So now at least we have the opportunity to see, okay, is it a total collapse of working memory, or is it a more modality specificity, right? So it's again, well, yeah, it's just some years ago that concept was brought in, right? To understand when we talk about a cognitive domain, are we still going to know that it's one is the person is performing better in one modality compared to the other modality before concluding it's a cognitive deficit, right? So that's one of the new elements which have been coming or taking into consideration within the field of assessment. But of course, first of all, within visual and auditory, right? But then tactile modality has slowly been sneaking into the picture, right? So, which is important to understand cognitive functions when generally, but also the people with congenital deaf blindness. So what do I mean by tactile cognitions in the tactile modality? Well, it follows the same pattern as when we talk about visual and auditory cognitions, right? We are talking about higher order mental processing, such as attention functions, where tactile attention. We could talk about tactile memory, whether we talk about semantic memory, about how we understand the facts of the world, and about autobiographical memory of how it's more the personal self-biographical memory of the person, right? So it's a different two types of it. And then you have tactile working memory, which I will mention more about in this lecture. So again, all this in the recent years, we have come to understand, yeah, there is a tactile modality for higher cognitions. It follows the same pattern as visual and auditory. It might appear differently or look differently or could be assessed differently, but it follows the same pattern functional wise and neuroscientifically wise. So this is like we know in the last year, there's a whole lot of literature and clinical literature on how this cognitions in the tactile modality is as robust as in the visual and auditory field, right? So that's just to put that across. So we know how this in a way could be understood, and then how could we use this knowledge to understand cognitive assessment. One of the tests which has been using this knowledge partially is a test called the haptic test battery. I think was from some Spanish colleagues, and it's about testing tactual abilities in the blind and visually impaired. So these are tests which ranging for tactual discrimination, systematic scanning, and shape coding to short-term memory and long-term memory tasks. So there is some test batteries in a way trying to use the tactile modality, especially in this case for people with blindness or visual impaired. So again, this test could be again asked whether, okay, they exist, right, compared to many mainstream tests. These are tests which are again more specific use for this population, but again using the concepts of tactile cognition in a manner. I would go into the concept of working memory because it's like one of the things I've been looking at in recent years, also in the tactile modality, right? So what is working memory? Many of you all know what we are talking about. It's about keeping information, storing information, but for a brief while, for a short time. That's the main element of working memory. So it seems to be a very critical function in our cognitive system, right? So, but again, we know more about what we call today as the cognitive working memory. This is keeping in mind and using task-relevant information during problem solving, and they may be involved in executive function. So this could be any kind of task, not necessarily in a test situation, but just everyday functions. When you try to solve a problem, or then we use this cognitive working memory to solve that. Working memory is so important in that manner. Well, in recent years, we are also talking about social working memory, that is keeping in mind what has occurred in the immediate past and integrate this social information in order to achieve a cohesive understanding of the present. This is, as you can see, very involved in the social cognitions of a person, right? So it seems there are two types of it, and neuroscience is showing us that there are two different systems, but they also overlap with each other, right? So it's again trying to put that across, that there are two types of it. One is more in a cognitive manner, we are problem solving. The other one is more in a more social interaction manner, where social working memory plays an important role, right? So this is one of the new elements when we understand working memory generally. But then we have the tactile working memory. As I said, it's like, okay, working memory in the tactile modality. This is the ability to store information for brief periods when using the sense of touch, right? So again, it's a sensory based working memory using the sense of touch, right? So this is how it's been described, and again, just to give you all some general understanding of it before talking more in specific to the groups which I've been asked to talk about. Okay. In recent years, some colleagues of mine from Israel, they have using actually the definition which have been mentioned in the tactile working memory scale. They have managed to describe a task which is called the tactual span, right? So we have the auditory span, which is the digital span. We have the visual modality span, and now finally we have a task which is measuring the tactual span, which is assessing working memory in the tactile modality. Again, a standardized test which could be used in a way. And what they have done is, like, they've done many studies of it, but just to give you all some examples of it, here it's to see how, when comparing the tactual span to visual and auditory span, as you could see, it's, many of you all know when I talk about the visual and auditory span, you have a forward element of it, and then you have a backward element of it, right? So this again, so you can see the different diagrams here regarding the auditory span, the visual spatial span, and the tactile span. It seems like the tactile span follows the same pattern as the other spans in a way, right? And that was very interesting in a sense, how they in a way normed this test in a way. And again, it's the longest sequence score regarding how many you could remember in the forward and in the backward manner. So it's again one of the first tests or aspect regarding the tactual working memory using a span test. And that's like, yeah, well, I was knew some of these colleagues, but when they presented their material, I said, yeah, this is the right way to go. So at least we have something to use regarding tactual span, right? As a standardized or norm test. But they also did a test regarding the group with congenital and acquired blindness, right? and since the visual tasks were not available or not suggested to be used for that group, they used only the auditory span test. And what they found was like the congenital and acquired blindness group, they performed similarly to each other, but they were significantly better in their tactual working memory tasks compared to the hearing and seeing sighted persons, right? So again, suggesting like blindness in a sense and congenital acquired seem to suggest that the working memory aspect of it seems to be much more robust, to use the word, or changed in people with congenital and acquired blindness. So this is again using a span test to see the difference between those groups, right? So very exciting. I think it's quite new, right? I've been corresponding with them, and they did their task during the Corona period, so they had a lot of time to work on it, but they were happy to produce or publish this. So again, giving us an idea about how a task in a span task in the tactual modality seems to be useful in a way to understand assessment, and again try to differentiate between groups in this sense, right? So yeah, interesting research regarding tactual span. So let's leave. So we know tactual working memory is existing, follows the same pattern as the visual and auditory, and even tasks or tests which measure visual and auditory span seems to follow the same pattern as the tactual span memory. So that's something very promising in a way. So let's go to the final part, which is more of like how to understand and assess tactile cognitive functions in people with deaf blindness, right? So let's start with that. So, well, again, just to give a kind of understanding, so we could assume due to the loss of vision and hearing, a person who's deafblind may be better equipped to display his or her cognitive abilities through the sense of touch and act of touching, right? So this is an assumption we need to consider, as we saw with people with blindness. Well, the tactile ability seems to be there or better than the sighted hearing. So it's again here, we still don't know how vision and hearing together in a way affects the tactile modality, but this is the first assumption we need to use or understand before understanding cognitions or cognitive assessments in people with deaf blindness. So what do we have to suggest this? What evidence do we have, right? So one of the earliest understanding of tactile memory in the acquired deafblindness, here's a study that compared the performance of deafblind individuals with sighted hearing participants on 4 tactile memory tasks. They showed that the deafblind participants took less time and made fewer attempts than the sighted hearing participants to feel and remember the target stimuli. So just by an acquired group of acquired deafblindness, they seem to perform better on a tactile memory task. Not that they remembered more tasks or items, but they are, use a cognitive concept, their processing speed was much better compared to the hearing and sighted, and that's very important to know. It's not just their memory was good, but the question here is like there was not significant difference here remembering items, but the significant difference is regarding processing speed, right? They could immediately, just by touching a certain thing, they knew what it was, right? So we know that something is, in a way, happening in the tactile modality in people with acquired deafblindness. And then some from the Danish literature, we have this study which shows that individuals with dual sensory loss perform significantly better on a tactile cognitive test battery than individuals with a dual sensory loss diagnosed with dementia. So, and again, what does this suggest? That okay, maybe the tactile cognitions are much more intact with when we talk about people with dual sensory impairment, but immediately if there is a change in their cognitive decline, it seems that will also affect their tactile cognitions, right? So the impact will not, you're not say because you are deafblind and your cognitions on the tactile modality, that will also decline as with the visual and auditory modality, right? So again, showing like, again, suggesting that, yeah, the cognitive cognitions of people with acquired deafblind in the tactile modality also follows the same pattern in the visual or the sighted and hearing, right? So again, suggesting something about tactile cognitions in acquired deafblindness. So yeah, there's suggestions for it, and maybe there's a possibility to use a standardized test in a manner to identify cognitions or cognitive changes in people with acquired deafblindness through the tactile modality, right? And yeah, there's the question of whether we could use the tactual span and understand the impact of tactile working memory in people with acquired deafblindness. So let's see what happens there. But anyway, all in all, it's about how this system seems to be more robust in people with acquired deafblindness. Okay, so let's leave the group of acquired deafblindness for a while and then start talking about the other group, which is the congenital deafblindness, right? So assessment of tactile cognitions, for instance, tactile working memory. Well, it's hard to use a tactual span test, as we all know, but again, it requires a sophisticated view of environmental action that includes attention to many factors, right? So again, to follow, we need to understand the aspect of working memory in the tactile modality, more knowledge about it, right, compared to vision and hearing. Only in recent years, we have focused on understanding cognitions in the working memory, cognitions in the tactile modality. And then again, also understanding the other pathways, like, for example, how do we use ecological assessment or dynamic assessment to understand these tactile cognitive functions. So again, what we need here is like, as it's an example, how do we optimize the physical, right, the learning situation and the social learning environment in a bodily tactile manner. This is again related to the dynamic assessment part of it, right? So how do we use not only the concepts of a cognition, but also how to regard the environment action, which is connected to this cognitive domain. So this brings us to the topic of which Sophia mentioned earlier, the tactile working memory scale, right? So what is this? This is a scale which has been developed to facilitate identification and promote intervention or planning of working memory in the body tactile modality, right? So again, it follows the principles, as you'll see, regarding pathways of ecological assessment, dynamic assessment, and trying to find out learning potential in everyday life, right? So it's again in those manner. It's not a standardized measure in a sense. It's not a standardized questionnaire, but it's more based on the principles of dynamic assessment and ecological assessment, right? So yeah, how does it look like? So well, it was based on some theoretical principles, which I've in a way mentioned. One of the things is understanding working memory, not just as one unit, but the unit in a broader cognitive system. So many of you all know the system quite well when we talk about the sensation, perception, cognitions of it. And in any modality, we're talking about, yeah, how information or sensations from, in this case, bodily tactile sensations would get into a sensory register, and then we have a short-term working memory units, and then how this is related to a long-term memory, and then we have an executive control, which will either facilitate or inhibit these units in a lower level. And then it's based on the fundamental understanding of how brain functions are, like regarding bottom-up processing, a sensory-based processing, but also a top-down processing where it's more controlled by cognitions. So it's following the same patterns as we know within the visual and auditory modalities, right? So it's again mentioned in the tactile working memory manual. But again, a good colleague of mine in Milan, Alberto Galace, is one of the most, done a lot of research and clinical work within the field of tactile cognition. So he is a collaborator within the tactile working memory scale, right? So this information only within in the late 2000s, we got information of how the systems, each units are functioning, right? With research, it seems that there are evidence suggesting this exists, right? So this is the more fundamental theoretical understanding of how we should understand working memory, not just by as a one aspect to measure, but putting this across the cognitive functions and see how this could be related to the other functions. So in a way, when we're talking about tactile working memory scale, the items will be related to perceptual sensations, will related to long-term memory. It might be related to executive control or metacognitions. So all these aspects are being taken into consideration in the tactile working memory scale. Assessment principles I mentioned many times it's about ecological functions, or the ones I mentioned earlier. It's about, the last one is dynamic, but it's also a transactional, right? So it's important how the partner and interaction partner needs to know to optimize the situation, such we could see the person's potentials, right? So it's also an important part of the tactile working memory scale is the transactional aspect of it. So it's through a transactional manner we could identify tactile potentials in a person with congenital deafblindness. Methodology, it was based again by a triangulation aspect of it. So we went across finding what are the domains and literature within the field. At that time, there were very few on tactile cognitions and very few on tactile working memory, but we went through, identified some of the domains and generated items. And then we used the items. It was more than 20, 30 items on the initial list. And then they were given as behavioral observations to colleagues within the deafblind field and people who didn't know deafblindness, to see whether these items could capture the contents which were relevant. And then finally we had an evaluation by experts to see whether it all fits, and it ended up being a 20-item scale. So this is the initial part of the validity, or establishing the validity. It's a very initial part of it, but there are studies which will be addressing the validity and reliability of assessment using the tactile working memory scale, and the research is in progress together with some colleagues in the Netherlands. So that's the way to still understand the validity of the scale. Okay, very briefly, well, this is how the scale will look like. Very hard for you all to read, but it's there in the sense it's based on 20 items. But again, we use the theoretical aspects to understanding tactile working memory. How is the person using this regarding cognitive, social cognitive processes, because working memory is both social and cognitive, and during task activities and social interactions in everyday life, right? So again, based on there are different types of working memory models of many of you all might know about. We started using the Alan Baddeley's model, which is the well-known working memory model, but found out that was not the right way to understand tactile working memory. Then we used the model of Fogginet, which also talks about encoding, maintaining, and manipulating aspects of it, which is very much related to the assessment part of working memory, which is used in any kind of span test. You encode, you maintain, you manipulate. So this is again the only difference is we are not using a task, we are using to see this in everyday activities. So this is how the scale will look at when, or the profile, you plot it in, you get a baseline, and then initially see how the person is doing. There are ways to in a way identify whether it's absent, emergent, or present, and then you get a baseline, and then the most important thing is like which kind of interventions we need to provide to get the item on the next level, right? So this scale comes also with a learning strategy, right? So they are based again on the three aspects of working memory strategies. And here in this sense, we're talking perceptual, social, cognitive, and cognitive abilities. And well, very shortly, well, there is a list of a compiled list of learning strategies, which will in a way give the assessor the possibility to say, oh, this is item 2, and then what are the necessary strategies we could use to in a way enhance that item behavior, right? So again, from that, a whole list of item-based or general strategies are mentioned in the list of checklist of learning strategies. So again, based on a dynamic assessment principle, you get a baseline, you know how to intervene, and you want to see a kind of change in their behavior, cognitive behavior. And this is how the scale is basically used, right? So as Sophia mentioned, we have the supervisor training seminar. Both Sophia and Miriam, I suppose she's around, and some others have done it. David Ulrich is around too, and so that has been done. So it's again, as I mentioned, well, very briefly about the tactile working memory scale. But again, we have this addressing the practical application, how to use it. We need to use, and the more you know, bring your own case and looking at different case illustrations, try to plot, score, interpret, and then plan the intervention using the learning strategy checklist. These are the aspects of it. So it's an ongoing supervisor training. So I'm happy there are some already supervisors. And see how this could be spread in the next level of using the scale in the Nordic countries. So it's again, I know Sophia is involved in translating the scale into Swedish, right? And even the learning strategy scale. So now she said like she's struggling to translate them into Swedish, some words and concept, but this is how it is. Like, I mean, we, as mentioned earlier, so it's like some concepts which are psychological concepts. We need to, in a way, digest them, and then we need to put them into the respective languages. So it's also an important part of a scale modification in a way. So so that these are interesting times in that manner. So this is, I suppose, my last slide. Now, yeah, well, I have a summary just to round up everything. So, well, I said a lot, and bringing it back all to two pieces. Well, we have standardized normative parameters we could use, but as we know, they could be less reliable and feasible, but use them accordingly, cautiously, because as I mentioned, there are some benefits using it. But then, of course, we could also think about affording other assessment pathways, right? In the sense, multimodality, right? In the sense, okay, visual auditory, but the tactile modality, and the different assessment pathways regarding, as I mentioned, ecological or dynamic assessment, right? So the purpose of it, again, to of course, in one way, if it's more diagnostic related, that will follow a different pathway. But then again, if you are more interested into asserting an individualized interventions, then maybe another pathway would be more feasible to use. But because then again, you could use it to help the person, family members, and staff, right? So this is like, and this is what the initial experience of people using the tactile working memory says that they could, use it not only for as an assessment tool, but then again to give individualized interventions and speak to family members and staff and other professionals too, right? So because it seems that we need concepts to understand cognitions, and then also regarding the deaf blindness and how the tactile modality could be an important part to understand cognition. So, okay, so this is the final slide. So, and I have just one. So, thank you for your attention. Yeah, hopefully it was as good as expected. I don't know, some of them might have been familiar, and some might be new. But again, just giving you a very fundamental idea of how assessment could be done, and hopefully this have been helpful and useful for you.